hello. I'm starting my timer right now. I'm Catherine Morrow. This is L'État, c'est quoi? Or the state, it's what? A variation on the famous line from Louis XIV, L'État, c'est moi, as he proclaimed his absolute monarchy. Of course, that absolute monarchy would not have existed without the machinations of Cardinal Richelieu and Mazarin after him. So we're already into a lot of complications. So the panel topic is various forms of social organization in science fiction and fantasy and variations thereof. And I will allow my panelists to introduce themselves first, please. We're going to go to, we'll start on my left. Well, sorry. We'll start with Terry Bruce.
Hi, everyone. I'm Terry Bruce. I am a science fiction, fantasy, and horror author. I have a contemporary fantasy series about ghosts in the afterlife, and a recently released short story collection called Souls, which is kind of slipstream new weird stories that came out just about a year ago. And if I was going to give you life advice, it would be drink your Ovaltine and don't release a book during a pandemic. And I'm currently working on a sci-fi novel that's kind of Firefly meets The Expanse. And I'm also got 25 years in community development and government policy development, which is part of why I'm here today.
Thank you. Ian?
Hi, I'm Ian McLeod. I write as Ian R. McLeod. Broadly, I've written science fiction, fantasy, and horror. From steampunky stuff such as my novel The Light Ages, to dystopian alternative fiction such as my novel The Summer Isles, to some far future stuff and quite a lot of fairly near future SF.
Thank you. Kestrel?
Hi, I'm Kestrel. I'm a disability and technology advocate. I'm also a graduate of MIT. I wrote my thesis on, the title was Decloaking Disability, Images of Disability and Technology in Science Fiction Media, and which was about sort of the tension we have in the cultural idea of what our culture believes technology for people with disabilities should do versus what people with disabilities believe technology should do for themselves. And in recent pandemic time, I have spent a lot of time involved in consumer advocacy and healthcare equity, and way too many meetings struggling against policymakers who are resisting improving healthcare for people with disabilities, people of color, queer people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Once again, I'm Catherine Morrow. I'm not a fiction writer. My background is buried in science fiction in terms of criticism, editing, fandom, education. And I'm a former longtime seller of books, so, and also have some fairly serious interest in history in general, especially ancient and medieval history, and also paleoanthropology, which I wish had been a major when I was in college. So I think we're all extremely interested in all sorts of examples of social organization, which you might say is an absolutely fundamental topic in science fiction, and goes back in philosophy. I mean, think about Plato's Republic, for heaven's sakes. You know, people have been trying to imagine not just the fantasy golden age, but how, as my advisor Phil Klass, also known as William Tenn, used to say when he taught his science fiction course, which I TA'd a couple times, how then shall we live? So, Terry, how about, can you take it from here and we'll start a discussion going? Mute. You have to unmute yourself, dear. Okay.
So yeah, what attracted me to this panel, one of the reasons I'm here, is kind of twofold. One is, in working on the science fiction novel right now, it's been really astounding to me the parts that like other writers and critique partners push back on, faster than light travel, terraforming entire planets, totally plausible. Very small tweaks to current social or political systems, that's a bridge too far. And so that's been very interesting. And then the other dynamic tension for me is that in my real life, in my other job, I've spent 25 years in government service, in direct service, trying to convince people we can do things differently and trying to move those systems from generally a deficit-based model to an asset-based model, whether that's moving people from a counseling perspective where you're telling your service recipients about their lives, what's best for them, an assumption that they're coming to you for expert advice, to a coaching model where people are kind of the best navigators of their own life and their own needs, a lot of what Kestrel was talking about, and how resistant service providers are to that idea. Or moving community development and community organizing from a deficit-based model where we focus on the problems in a community to the strengths and start building from there. Or even trying to move organizations and organizational development from majority rules to consensus model of governing. And people are like, couldn't possibly do that, Terry. That's, way out there talk. And so, yeah, that brought me to this panel about why is it so hard to write realistic and different things that people will buy into in science fiction. And I feel like we're just baked into this idea that things can't be different than they currently are, that we currently have the best version, and that changes are like, wouldn't work.
That's quite fascinating, because the early science fiction fans, were very, part of the reason why we have all these tropes is that the early science fiction fans were trying to not get people to laugh at them when they talked about, well, why can't we have space travel? Why can't we go to the moon? Why can't we do this or that? And a lot of them were, in fact, pretty extremely socially progressive in their real lives, but they were really trying to push for positive change in many cases. So, and now we have the success of what Jim Morrow likes to call the cargo cult of science fiction. The rocket ships, all the robots, all the shiny pieces that people are, time travel that people are obsessed with. The mass market has accepted. All right, but these other things are still to be fought for. They're not as glamorous and shiny, perhaps. By the way, I think if any of the panel members want to say something in the midst of all this, it seems to me it might make sense to just raise your hand so I can recognize you, and so we don't end up. Yes, and yes. Okay, here we go. Ian.
Well, yeah, I suppose talking of background, I actually I took a degree in law, and then I worked in the British Civil Service.
Oh, wow.
And I think a lot of the systems that we have, and obviously law and government are two of them, are ways of sort of controlling and making sense of the world. One of the things that struck me all the years ago when I first came across SF was a trope which I think has faded now, but is still there to a degree, is that you would arrive on this new planet, Captain Kirk, and somebody in a fairly stylish silver suit would greet you and then explain how the society worked in relatively straightforward terms, and it all added up and made sense. And to me, the basic sort of friction I think that I find as a writer is that the real world makes very, very little sense. And what Terry was saying about, well, I don't buy this, I don't buy that. So many things are very, very hard to understand that have actually happened in recent times in the real world. And to a degree, I think we find them still pretty improbable. I'm sure we'd have our own examples. Whereas when you're creating a fiction, it has to be far more plausible than a lot of the real world actually is. I think people would struggle to understand if Captain Kirk arrived in a world where they were suffering severe climate change and were doing very little about it. Say, yeah, I know, it's terrible, isn't it? But there's an element of
Yeah, it's and of course you're coming up with one of the basic things when you're doing fiction. It's impossible to create a real society from scratch because it's too complicated, but fiction doesn't do that any more than it makes you count the individual hairs on the arm of a body of a character in a novel. You have to it's that good old word verisimilitude. You're trying to make people get into the story, into the novel, so they believe their background, and then you can do whatever it is you want to do with that, and which could be any number of things that are totally disconnected from actual kinds of community development or history or anything else. Kestrel, are you ready to? Kestrel, are you there?
Yeah, so following up on what Ian said, when I wrote my thesis back in 2006, I really wanted to write it about a lot of the 80s and 90s science fiction, including Miles Verkozigan, who I found really fascinating and inspirational to me. But a lot of what I needed to write about wasn't there at the time. There wasn't a lot of discussion of people with disabilities in society written about at that time. So I had to go back and kind of recreate it. And what I found interesting in trying to find resources was that many of these science fiction stories always had these kind of outsider groups that were improvised, and people with disabilities kept showing up in them. And one of the earliest ones I found was Theodore Sturgeon's More Than Human, which was published in like 1953, but was actually based on a short story. And I can't remember the title right now, but the short story was from 1940 something. And it had this group of Gestalt therapy. And so there was that. And then I got really fascinated with the movie Blade Runner, sorry, which had all these images of disability that no one ever talked about. It had, these ongoing like dwarf people who showed up all the time mocking the protagonist, and no one ever commented on that. Or the Edward J. Olmos character, or Sebastian, or even Tyrell himself. And the reason that all these people were like left behind on Earth was that they weren't perfect enough to emigrate to the perfect golden planet that everybody else had immigrated to. And no one ever asked, no one ever talked about like, why were these people left behind? And so when the replicants came to Earth, they were another improvised group. So, science fiction is full of these improvised groups of outsiders who rebel against the established forms of society. And we're having that right now during this pandemic. We're having people who are rebelling against the established idea that, we need to work 9-to-5 jobs, and we need to be productive, and we need to give over our bodies to work for capitalism and to produce money so that we can buy more things, so that we can save for our retirement, because our bodies have become old and broken because we worked 9-to-5, or even more than 9-to-5, 9-to-9. And we've ruined our bodies to like contribute to a society for money. And one of the things that's coming out of the pandemic is just breaking away from this idea of why are we working? Why are we killing ourselves during a pandemic? And so again, we're having improvised groups, improvised ideas of like, there has to be something different. And that's one of the things that I find really fascinating in science fiction is people are improvising different things. Oh, and another one I wanted to bring up is the Murderbot stories. This is the planet that he ends up with is this planet
Whose
of
stories are
people.
those? Sorry.
What?
Whose stories are those?
Martha Wells.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, the planet he ends up on is a preservation, which is they're kind of like socialists, and they ended up on this planet because they were on one of those life ships that, you know, had been in space for like generations, and they're really appalled at the whole idea of a capitalist society. Like they just don't understand it. They've been so separated from it for generations.
Yeah, so that really does sound like a socially, that's a lot of, it's saturated with social awareness.
Right,
Yeah.
and healthcare and education and everything is taken care of by the society.
Yeah, and actually what you were talking about with the outsider groups, I mean, that is science fiction. That's American science fiction fandom, is outsider groups who would like to, I mean, small groups of people who feel, and this was even true. I mean, I'm 71. Okay. So when I came to Penn State and Fred Ramsey started the Penn State Science Fiction Society, we were just a little clump of outsiders. And that even then in 1969, that was still the case. You know, it was small groups of people that were banding together as outsiders saying, wow, we're different. Now what? Ian? What?
Well, I think.
Just a second. I'm sorry, Kestrel. You can respond to that. Can you just let Ian talk for a minute?
Sure.
And we'll come back.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sure.
That's okay. So
Yeah.
we're all.
Okay.
We're all
I think I was just going to say the outsider thing is very much a theme of SF, and when we're talking about the societies that we create, one of the commonest things that any writer will do, especially in the science fiction genre, is who is going to be oppressed or find this difficult or impossible, or is going to be put on the outside, or who is going to resist it. So very often in science fiction, a society is either created which is dystopian and horrible in an obvious way, or societies which are very shiny and golden and attractive. We're generally, as a reader and a writer, generally expecting that's not very interesting anyway, but we're expecting to find something deeply wrong with them. So the outsider theme, which, as Kestrel rightly points out, does very much fit in with disability being a more enabled, because a lot of the enhancements they're great for everybody, but they're not for you, which I suppose anybody who's tried to get access with a disability to many common facilities knows all about that in our world. So it's both a metaphor for it, but it's also very much the outsider trope is particularly significant, I think, in SF, and certainly there with societies.
Yeah, Kestrel, did you want to finish your thought before we go to Terry?
Yeah, I just wanted to also to add that, connected to your comment that that outside improvised group of fandom itself is also connected to hacker culture. You know, hacker culture also identifies with science fiction. And again, they also have these improvised groups that, for good or ill, you know, believe that work to create different kinds of cultures, different kinds of spaces of how they believe money, consumerism, living, entertainment, work, whatever.
Right. And yes. Sorry. Yeah, I was maybe need to go to Terry, but I was going to say that's also partially because the overlapping Venn diagram of computer people in science fiction, woo, is a big overlap from the very beginning. So it is interesting to see how that has all become part of the mainstream culture, really. So sorry, was there, I just wanted to throw that in. Are you okay to move to Terry now? Or,
Yes, sorry.
okay, good. No, it's fine. We're good. Terry, go ahead.
No, so it's interesting. A comment just came up that apparently was made in the Discord about if you see an ideal society, you haven't looked hard enough. And I think, you know, it's very interesting that Ian's background is law. My undergraduate was pre-law. And, you know, our society, part of the foundation of it is being resistant to change. The law is so difficult to change. And, you know, American government, we set up our government the way we did to make sure that change was slow, because giant shocks to the system could undermine the foundation of our society, is the theory. So it's taught to us, you know, from a young age, we're indoctrinated to don't question, don't look too hard, because change is kind of bad, or fast change is really bad. And so it becomes really interesting as a writer, trying to put yourself outside of that enough to make these really truly distinct, different things. And it's interesting, there was a talk that was recorded, so I do recommend if anybody didn't see it, and I'm blanking on her name and I'm so sorry, I think it's Remy Scott, but it was about kind of history. And she said anything that you can think of for like the future has already been tried in the past. It may not have been successful. It may have been this very brief blip in history, but people have tried utopias and different types of societies. And so, you know, as writers, how do we convince people that the things we're writing about are plausible when it's in the very nature of us by nurture? I wouldn't say it's human nature. I would say by training to not question society, to accept it, and to go, oh, that utopia thing over there is weird. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that has most upset my critique partners and other writers about the sci-fi story I'm working on is I have an entire group of people who don't have names. They're known by their job titles only. They're assigned kind of job titles as youth and trained up in those. And people are losing their minds over this. And they're like, that's just not plausible. And I said, you do understand, like, the last name Smith, Harrier, Whittier, those are job titles. Pliny the Younger, those are job titles. This has already been done in history. Like, this is actually not imagination. This is actually something from history. And they're like, no, it's not acceptable. And I'm like,
well, yeah, that's what happens. See, that's what happens when you have imagination and decide to do something different, which is arguably what has dragged us to this point for good and ill, is the people with imagination who fired up everybody else. Yeah, I'm not sure I agree that anything has been done in the past, but a heck of a lot of things have been done in the past.
Apparently, yeah. Jesus sex parties apparently were a thing. Who knew? Like, if you've got that, I don't think anything's a bridge too far at this point.
No. I mean, in terms, and it brings us to another, and people can veer off from this, but there's one more thing I wanted to bring up as part of this, which is, we can discuss the societies that are being created, but also, you know, as creators, the reason for creating this society can be very different. I think Ursula Le Guin is a good case in point. I mean, you have the sort of high fantasy rite of passage Wizard of Earthsea books, and then you have the dispossessed, you know, anarcho-syndicalism versus capitalism as a flat out utopia, but from the point of view of Shevek, of course, or her character. So it's just, what axe are you trying to grind, or what are you trying to explore in every case? And so is it background? Is it just a Jungian archetypal heroic journey background, or are you just trying to? I'm not talking about creating like oddball things just to be different and catch people's attention, the way, say, for example, people might do in a mystery novel where they get a strange background so that they can put a detective in there and people can go to a different place. I mean, I have nothing against that. It's just when you're doing science fiction and fantasy, it's always purpose built in some way. So does anyone want to follow up on that, or we'll just go to something else?
I think purpose built. I mean, we all carry around a map of the world as it is, right? And of course, for all of us, it's extremely different, and that map varies from circumstance to circumstance, whether we're with a family or socially or in a work context, you know, or talking now. But and that map, it's possible to use some of these maps, such as, say, religion or Marxism, as a way of looking at the current world, but also at the future. And there's a sort of an argument that goes on in our minds, some of which is subconscious, I think, as to exactly what we think humanity is capable and what we think, how kind or unkind the universe really is. I think that's a question we're constantly asking ourselves, and to a degree, any sort of social structure is a way of coping with that. And so we're trying to sort of argue our way into finding something that makes sense to us, first of all, from our own experience, and then hopefully we're speaking to other people in a way that they will either identify with or find so weirdly fascinating that it gives them an insight into other people's views of the world.
Anyone? Kestrel? Is that a hand up? No, there's some hand up somewhere.
I did have my hand up, actually.
Okay, good.
Taking it down too soon, I guess.
That's okay.
So I want to say that I am basically an optimist. I wake up in the morning and I have a plan for the day, and I feel pretty optimistic that, you know, things will be good and the world is improving. But I am also a disability activist involved in healthcare equity over the past year and a half. And the stories I hear from other people are frankly terrible and terrifying on a daily basis, almost on a daily basis. And so it has radicalized me in a way that I never thought. I had my 55th birthday on Thursday, and I never thought that as I got older, I would foresee myself as being an 80-year-old woman standing on the barricades giving the finger to the man. But that's where I expect to be a few decades from now.
Good for you.
So, I mean, one of the things that happened recently, and I need to share this story because frankly, it's so unbelievable. I get services from the Massachusetts Commission for the Blind, and the commissioner is a governor appointee. He has no experience with working with people for the blind. And he sent out commissioned a survey to supposedly learn about their consumers. And the very first question was, what is your original gender as listed on your birth certificate? And this goes into a government database, and he feels that this is an okay question to ask people. And so now I'm in a battle with the commissioner over why he feels it's okay to even ask these questions, let alone the complete insensitivity of these questions. And so, I mean, we're talking about a government that feels it's okay to ask people these questions and put them in a database. And if you do something that they want to investigate you, it's all there for them.
And this is Massachusetts, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Potentially, you know, quite enlightened in many ways.
And there's a pressure that to get services, if you don't answer their questions, you may not receive services.
Yeah, well, yeah, sorry.
So
that's a bureaucratic concept.
So,
yes.
You know, I'm sorry if that's a personal story, but just to say that this is the kind of thing that we now live in a government where these things happen. And, you know, so I'm not a writer, but if I was a writer, I would be writing stories that basically are, you know, waving red flags, going, people, you know, we need to be more aware, we need to be more alert, we need to be doing something about stopping this kind of, you know, government, you know, prying into your personal life and feeling that it's okay to use this information against you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly, you know, well, you may not be a fiction writer, but you're dealing with the same things that a lot of science fiction writers and other people have been dealing with for years. It's the same fear of the bureaucracy and what could potentially happen.
It's like a Philip K. Dick story, which I used
like
to think was extreme, and
No,
now I'm like, here we are.
Well, it's also Huxley and Orwell and everybody. Anyway, Terry, yes. No, that's perfectly appropriate. You're right. Terry?
Well, I think, you know, Kestrel's story of, I have many similar stories, having worked in government for 25 years. And what's really interesting, you know, as a writer and kind of bridging that gap there is, you know, as Ian said at the beginning, like in fiction, things have to make sense, right? Like, yeah. And there's logic to why they're asking those questions. And in fact, probably at the commission in the governor's office, there is some kind of logic. And to those people, it seems perfectly reasonable to ask these ridiculous questions. But in fiction, right, like that would be, we're in the Hunger Games, is if we're looking at like the government from the outside, right? Like they're just like, wahaha, how can we be evil today? And so there's
fantasy writ large, yes.
Yeah, or like this banal evil happens,
right?
Because it's not banal, it's because people are really cruel. But it's like, yeah, in the real world, a lot of it is just banal stupidity, bureaucracy. You know, I just watched this episode of Leverage the other night where they're sort of taking on the government, and they're like, there's this appropriation to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon doesn't want the money, but they have to give them the money by law, and they can't use the money for something else. So they're like, but this doesn't make sense. But
this is the nature. I mean, you think about it. I mean, we're created by bureaucracy in many ways. The ancient city-states ran on bureaucracy. And in fact, the Pax Romana, which is where Western civilization, as we know it now, essentially emerges and stabilizes itself in a way, was the bureaucrats were pretty reliable. So is bureaucracy itself an evil? No. However, misuse of power or favored groups for being well, we've had a hell of a lot of that in the last few years. So we don't have to go there. We all know. But
I just want to finish one. Sorry, Kestel, I just wanted to finish my thought there, which was that, you know, in fiction, we only have so many words and so many pages, right? And so everything we do tends to be a shorthand. And we don't, you know, people would say, this is too much detail, this is too much world building and scene setting. If you give the 10,000 years of history that led up to the planet where, you know, climate change is happening and people are doing nothing about it, like there's a reason like that is happening, and we can make it plausible in fiction if we can give all that context in history. But that's the boring parts of world building we're told as writers to cut out, that nobody wants to read the treatise.
Yeah, that's maybe more of a right. It's really hard to say because what's your audience? But anyway, just a second. We haven't actually answered anybody's questions and we're past the midpoint. So did somebody else want to throw something in before we address one of the questions that we got, since we did promise people we would look at some questions? I just wanted to. Oh, go ahead, Kestrel.
I just wanted to add that a couple of centuries ago, de Tocqueville said that if democracy was doomed in any sort of way, it was by bureaucracy.
Yeah, he was also afraid of the mass. You know, as I recall, he was afraid of the effect of the masses, what the downside of DEMOCR is, right? In some ways. So yeah, but that's always worth remembering. Ian, thank you. Ian,
just to really follow on from Kestrel's point, describing a social problem. What writers do then is the world is either changed and improved, or things get worse. And that's really, you know, the narrative of this is a social difficulty in which a lot of SF is about and a lot of fantasy is about. The story can go two main ways, really. The things can improve, or things can stay the same, or well, in fact, three ways, or they can get worse. That again, I think there's a sort of heroic fantasy where the evil overlord is overthrown, and then there's 1984 where it's all back to square one.
Yeah, no, we need to now look. I've been turning away like this because I'm the one who's looking at the questions on the side. Let's see. Here's I missed. It's not appearing here because I am very inexperienced at this. However, there was an earlier question about we're talking about the science. What I was talking about, the science fiction fans as outsiders, but we also have the other aspect of that is we are the whole science fiction tropes of we are the superior ones, and we're worthy of survival. And how do we choose, this survivor porn sort of thing where, oh, we're the most intelligent, we're the most wonderful, and we're going to survive the Holocaust, and we're going to the nuclear Holocaust, and we're going to go settle a new planet. So yeah, we've got that in science fiction too, which is almost like anti-utopia. It seems to be utopian, but in fact, it's pretty darn nasty in many ways. So that's not exactly what the question was, but it was close. What the times in science fiction where that sort of thing has happened, the select number of people go off to the stars. So does anybody want to pursue that or not? No.
I don't know. Is that like the Foundation series by Asimov?
No, that's a lot of people. No, that's a lot of stuff. So
yeah.
The list is way too long to.
Yeah, this is like the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. Yeah. What right? I mean, as with them, what right do we as a species have to imagine we should go and inflict our flawed systems upon any other world when we haven't sorted them out on this world? But that's a great topic for science fiction to explore, and it has done in many ways and in many times.
Okay. Got a couple of all right, not so far. Okay, let's see, here's one. Are there some specific examples of world building in fiction that panelists could point to that make a totally foreign to current experience type of society or culture seem realistic, plausible, or prophetic? Well, I would say that's a lot of science fiction, but are there any examples that, how about striking examples or things that the panelists have enjoyed or been impressed by, or that were sort of important to your development? Something you said, look at this society, wow, I wonder, or how about if we look at this society and go, all right, Terry.
Well, I'm gonna not talk about a fiction example. I'm gonna give a real life example as a way of giving my fiction answer.
Sure. Well, it's just what affected you.
Yeah. So
it feeds into your fiction anyway, whether you want it to or not, right? Anyhow.
So when I was working for the Massachusetts Office of Workforce Development, they brought in a new guy, a total quality assurance guy, who was going to change the culture. And there's two elements of that culture. One was you have to make decisions by consensus. You have to have 100% buy-in. And people are like, no, you could never do that. People will never agree to things.
No.
And the other is that the people closest to the work should make the decisions about the work because they know it the best. Managers are too far removed. And so there was this big project. So we said, okay, all of us, the low-level flunkies, the managers and the administrative assistants, we will run this project, this whole program, and we will do it by consensus. And the managers of the bureaucracy had a meltdown. They were like, this is going to be impossible. And they're like, well, who's going to be in charge? We said, it'll be flat. It'll be consensus. And they said, but without a manager telling people what to do, how will people do stuff? Nothing will get done. And if you don't have somebody assigning the crap jobs to somebody, nobody will do all the crap stuff that nobody wants to do. We said, well, this is what this dude's being paid for to try this. Let's try it.
Oops.
We went in, and it turns out not everybody has the same skills or interests. And so universal
God.
definition of what's a crap job is there's no universal definition. We divided the work perfectly equitably. Everybody took what they wanted. Nobody was assigned anything they didn't want because we just had a good split of people who had different interests. We got everything done. We did everything by consensus. And so, and going into that, I also had doubts. I was like, I don't know if we can do consensus because we spend a lot of time fighting in meetings in this organization and nobody agrees on anything. And that just changed my mind. And so, the question is there something that's past the suspension of disbelief for me in fiction? No longer, because based on my experience, the things that I believe about what are possible and not possible were revolutionized. That was the start of my journey into moving into like asset-based community development and changing power structures, in community organizing instead of having outside entities coming in, starting with the people who live in that community or who were affected by that issue. So fiction, nothing is beyond my belief. I think all of it's like, this is interesting. Maybe that could work.
And also, I think you're doing, there's a fair amount of evidence that that's who we are as a species. I mean, that's how we got here. We're cooperators and we're networkers. And that's how we got to take over from all our other sister cousin species who were out there when Homo sapiens sapiens was out there. And because we're just a heck of a lot better at connecting with each other and also helping each other. Ian?
That's also one of the rules of being a lifelong learner, is to basically not get overly attached to a belief, to be able to change your mind about things that you think you're absolutely sure that, like your idea that you didn't think people would be able to come to a consensus. You were able to change your mind about that, and that is, the best part of that learning experience. So the ability to drop a belief that that is no longer useful.
Yeah.
And also this empowered people quite a bit. I mean, that was a big piece of it, I think, where they feel like, wow, we could really do this. We say this sounds like idealist Marxism, but but again,
if it was fiction, nobody would have believed it.
Yeah, exactly. Ian, what?
Well, I just to sort of mention, going back to the question a little bit, the actual sort of examples in fiction. I mean, I grew up reading Clarke and Asimov, and also J.G. Ballard, who at the time was seen as this weird fantasist. But it seems to me he was more on the nail with a lot of his books than, sadly, Arthur C. Clarke was in, say, 2001.
Yes.
So sometimes the weird stuff turns out to be true. And a more recent book, The City and the City by China Mieville, which describes two cities coexisting in a sort of slightly sort of weird juxtaposition of dimensions, but the people of the two cities train themselves to ignore the other city that's also pretty much juxtaposed, if I can say that. So that struck me as a really way out vision, but somehow made sense in terms of human behavior at the end of the day, I suppose, is the thing we're often looking at. Not always, obviously, but yeah.
Oh, well,
actually, I thought of one. It can be a little squicky, but Theodore Sturgeon's The Microcosmic God, which could be kind of rewritten as an AI story. It's basically a scientist who develops these.
Yeah, I think everybody knows that one, right? Terry, do you know Microcosmic? Sorry to interrupt, but I think a lot of the audience knows that. At least the Readercon audience knows the story, so you don't have to summarize it. So, but you can go ahead and make your comment on it.
Well,
because you only have 5 minutes. That's all.
Oh, just that it's these creatures are basically kind of
the neoterics,
amorphous, non-specific, and yet they have all the what we would consider to be human characteristics of curiosity, ability to learn, problem solving, all this, and basically create an entire society and culture.
Right. Sorry, I got to interrupt you because we've got like 4 minutes left. Okay.
That's basically it.
Yeah, that's okay. And also I'll throw my opinion, a microcosmic God. Another interpretation would be this is the chap whose name I can't remember now, who creates the neoterics, could be thought of as John Campbell getting all his writers at Astounding to come up with all sorts of ideas and to solve all sorts of problems. But so I'm glad you brought up Sturgeon, because he's an early humanist and very much always out there in the forefront. So Terry, did you have, I think we're getting very close to, I have 4 minutes left. So Terry, did you want to say something else? I don't see any other questions that we can on the side that we can pursue with any sort of reasonable discussion in the amount of time that's remaining to us. So if anybody wants to make some final statements here.
Well, yeah, I guess as a concluding statement, then I would say that personally, my belief is that, and this is going to be very provocative, you can come to the strong women table and argue with me later if you want, that anything that people find as stretching their suspension of disbelief and too unbelievable has more to do with the reader's limitations and their lens on how they're viewing the world than actually on the limitations of what is possible.
Okay. Ian?
Well, can I mention alternate history as something which we...
Oh, yes, please do, because you're a master of that.
Well, yeah, well, I certainly very much enjoyed dabbling in it, and that's probably a slightly more forensic way, because you run the tape back,
yeah,
and then you run it forward again, but you're able to pinpoint one or two things rather than everything, which can be quite liberating, and is certainly a way of exploring wrong turns and right turns that history and humanity have made.
Yeah, and I think it also, if you read history, you realize, or you're interested in history and to any degree, you realize that the contingencies, what Terry was saying about was quoting someone saying almost anything could have happened in the past, did happen. Well, almost anything could have happened. You realize that what we have now is very contingent on things that we know could have gone differently, and things we don't even know about at all. So, for example, one of the paleoanthropology, things is, what happened to the Neanderthals? Well, we probably inbred with them. Maybe we brought some diseases, but they gave us some genes. We gave them some. So we don't even know what exactly happened there.
But there's always things like people will list like, what is the first hack? The first hack was in 70 something. And then there's a story of the first hack was when Marconi tried to demonstrate how super secret the telegraph was, and some other person like hacked his wireless telegraph when he was doing the demonstration, like, in the Victorian period. So there was a Victorian hacker. I love that story.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, humans have been messing around with information in every way, shape, or form since there was such a thing. We've got about, and let's see, 50 seconds according to my chronometer here. So I'd like to say thank you to everybody. And what's that? No, we don't have anything else. Here we go. 1 minute. Discussion can continue in. All right. I am now reading the message for anyone who's watching this. 1 minute. Discussion can continue in hallway 1 on Discord. So anyone who is able to or interested in, and I know you said that I think you said that you really can't do that, Kestrel, because you're not set up for that, and you can't see the things on Discord because it's not set up for people who are visually impaired. So you're not snubbing people.
I'm not. I was just unable to figure this out with my screen reader, so I apologize.
Oh, no apology necessary. If anyone else wants to, I will go on it for a while to see if there's anything happening. But if Ian or Terry
yeah,
wants
sure,
to join, you want to come?
Happy to.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy
All
to
right,
look
so
in.
here
Yeah,
we go.
yeah.
There goes my timer. So, all right. Yes, thank you very much, everyone. That was great. As usual, it went somewhere that we didn't expect it to go, but that's what we like. Okay, that's very science fictional. Okay.
Thank you for letting me
bye.
run on,
Thank
everybody.
you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Nice
Bye.
listening to your accent, Ian. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Lovely
You're
to
all
meet
great.
you, Kestrel. Okay, and
Thanks.
thank you all.
Bye,
Thanks.
everyone.
You.
I agree.
Now what? Don't do anything.